Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The challenge about talking about trust in the digital economy, let alone e-commerce, is that if we look at where we are today, much of what we see is devices such as this. And most of the people who we encounter, our youth, have grown up with this. The digital economy and e-commerce is something that they take for granted. Whereas if we look at historically, the concept of trust, let alone commerce, you were used to encountering a physical shop floor, you were used to physically engaging with someone, you therefore could look somebody in the eye and you could actually purchase. Now in the digital space, the challenge which we've got is that trust underpins everything, and the trust which you are talking to is trust that you can't necessarily feel, see, or experience beyond this. It comes down to items such as the customer experience. If your search engine is optimized, for example, and the first thing that appears when you type into Google is cell phone cover, or motor car, or any other word, depending on how the search engine has been optimized, that company will be the first thing to pitch up. You could find 200 links down, there's a better company, but ultimately, the search engine optimization determines which customer experience or which customer site is seen first. And if we don't understand how this all fits together, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm trying to get the laser pointer to work. My apologies, as we try to get this right. Let's see if I can get this to work. I'm pointing to the top block, the underpinning of the commercial ecosystem in the digital economy. If we're not able to understand that in the economy of the e-commerce, there's no simple one provider provides everything. What you will find that has happened with the growth of the digital economy is there are many companies that white label. For example, you purchase products from China, you put your own brand on top of it, and you resell it. The customer doesn't necessarily know that the product comes from somewhere else. But in the event that something fails, the customer comes to you first and says, why is the problem with the product? What ultimately also becomes a challenge is that when you're in a digital economy, you have to try and establish how do you actually maintain and extend the depth of the relationship you have with your customers. In the case of at least physical contact with the customer gets to know you. You build a relationship. It's like if you go into any hotel, the concierge greets you, you know the concierge, there's somebody who you can build a physical connection to. But in the case of a website, if the website is down, what do? You go to another company that provides the very same service. And ultimately, when you then start looking at this, how do you build a brand? Because what determines trust, let alone loyalty, is brand awareness. Now, if you look at that, a simple thing like brand experience. When I was here in Algeria, I bought a Condor smartwatch. Right? I bought a Condor tab. And the reason I did that was because I had a good experience with the first product, so therefore I automatically thought the smartwatch must work. Now, this is what happens with customers. Once they have one positive experience, your ability to leverage the next positive experience becomes even more stronger. And that's how you ultimately build trust. But the ability to sell, and I'm using Condor as an example, the multiple different electrical goods that they sell, beyond just the cell phone and smartwatch, comes because you know the brand. How do you move ultimately from the issue of people browsing on the cell phone, looking at the devices, and then actually getting them to go into online, let alone a shop? And what does that do for your marketplace? Because if all your customers are starting to shop online, do you then suddenly close down all your physical shops? And what does that mean in terms of growth? Because if that becomes your challenge, what business are you really in? Now, if you talk about, for example, Amazon, started as a bookseller. Amazon is no longer a bookseller. Amazon's business is logistics. They basically move this device to here. They don't care who makes this device. But when they started as a bookseller. Now that fundamentally changes the way in which you work. Because suddenly you've got to reconceptualize how do you take a brand that is competitive online or in the physical space and match them so that you have one brand experience. And how do you differentiate that brand in the digital market space? The challenge about trust is the following. And if you recall anything of this presentation, I would ask that it be this. Trust is subjective. Each of us have a different degree of what we expect before we will say we trust somebody. And once you understand that trust is subjective and not an objective element, there's no test for trust. then it becomes easier to understand the elements of trust, because certain elements of trust are common. For example, when we start talking about how do we unpack this, people, for example, from a trust perspective, in terms of how trust works, you've got to be able to verify people in terms of online. How do you know the person who you are selling to is who they claim to be? Let alone that they are not using a stolen credit card and committing identity fraud when they purchase the item. Because you may say, but of course the item has to be delivered to their house, so clearly we'll know where they are if they commit identity fraud. The answer is not necessarily. There are many companies that offer drop shipping, where if you don't have a US postal address and you want to buy something from the US, you send it to literally a mail carrier whose job it is to forward it anywhere in the world you are. In terms of data, if you look at now many of the websites you access, they will tell you they use cookies. But how do those cookies actually get used? What information do they draw off your actual browsing habits, and how is that information controlled? Do you consent to that information? In other words, do you agree that they will put cookies out there and they will monitor without knowing what they're monitoring for on your device? And the challenge about trying to get around usage, let alone clarity of how this is used, is how you think information has been drawn versus how it may be used may be totally different. Take Facebook and what happened with Cambridge Analytica. We supply information online, but we don't always know how it's going to get used or abused. In terms of the systems, the issue of advanced analytics, in terms of not only being able to diversify what we do from a marketing point of view, but the ability to actually target specifically what you want to sell to someone. So if I'm searching online and I'm looking for something as simple as a men's tie, I keep on Googling men's ties. And as I Google men's ties, what happens? There's a cookie that says he's looking for ties. So when I go onto another website and there's adverts running on either side, it pops up examples of men's ties because it's hoping to sell me a men's tie. Now that's a simple example of analytics. Right? But what if that example gets even more intrusive? For example, it starts literally saying things like, not only what tie do you want, but it starts making, for example, these blue ties cheaper than the red ties, because somebody who's a seller wants to get rid of all their blue ties. You see, the challenge is that advanced analytics is wonderful until it gets abused to drive you in a certain direction. We've spoken about, during the conference, machine learning or artificial intelligence or automated intelligence, depending on where you frame it from. The challenge about machine learning and the ability of computers literally to learn and become cleverer is that they are talking about the concept that in about 30 years' time we'll reach singularity. The construct of where literally computers will be able to outthink a person, so to speak. Is it likely? Is it possible? That's speculative. But here's the challenge. When you put machine learning and you put all these elements together and you get to chatbots, you start getting to a very interesting challenge. You think you're talking to somebody on the other side of the internet. It's not. It's a computer responding to you. Right? Customer service agents are a typical example of chatbots. If you look at online shopping agents, the one thing I always like is when I buy things from China online. And I have a question, so I ask for the robot to do literally, I click on the little robot, and I can type in, under frequently asked questions, a question. If I can't get an answer, then I can ask for supposedly, I say supposedly, a human to talk to me. I don't know if it's a human talking to me because they speak perfect English. But the person understood everything I said, and it's more likely than not a chatbot, not a person. And that is actually where the challenge comes in. Because suddenly when you're on e-commerce and you want to sell across multiple countries with different languages, automating a chatbot that can talk in any language in the world is a lot easier than hoping you've got customer service agents who can speak in every language in the world. And this is how the transformation comes about, because what's happening is people no longer trust necessarily that on the other side there's a person. They are dealing with the experience they have, which is what is generating trust. And that is why you will hear me saying, if you want to take anything out of the presentation, it is that trust is a subjective element. Because we all have different barriers to trust. For some of us, for example, we need to look you in the eye, we need to shake your hand and talk to you in order to buy something. For other people, they'll go online. The question comes about is, when will you do which? The answer is it depends on the value of the product. The more expensive the product is, the more you're going to depend on the product, the more you want to see somebody. The more likely the product is commoditized, in other words, you can just buy it from the same person regardless of the price, like buying Pepsi or Coca-Cola, You wouldn't mind, you'd buy it at the cheapest possible price. The degree or dimension of trust may be less in that space. So what then becomes the barriers ultimately that one has to contend with? Firstly, online, there's a different construct of privacy. People's ideas of what they keep private online and what, let alone the security concerns, are different. Let me give you a good example of this. Have you seen people post photos of their children online? Literally. They put photos of their children doing things online. Now, most of the people who, if you sit down and say, do you realize if you do that, you are presenting a risk because suddenly somebody could kidnap your child? They say, yes, we recognize the risk, but everybody posts photos of our children. Right? In other words, but if you said to them, would you take photos of your children and post them in the neighborhood? People say, no, we're not going to do that. See, this is where what the behavior online and the behavior in the physical world is different. And this is where it becomes harder to explain to people. For example, when you have to fill in any application. So when I wanted to join the Sheraton guest program, they asked me 4 questions. What's my favorite holiday destination? Right? What's my favorite Sheraton? Right? What's my favorite airline? The one they didn't ask me is what's my mother's name. Normally when I join these things, they ask me what's my mother's name. I don't know why. Then they ask me what's my, normally I get asked that what's my father's name, which is my first school, which was the first car I drove. Now if you think about this, those questions are, those questions, ladies and gentlemen, are almost common to nearly every guest program you can ever find. This one, as I said, didn't ask me that, but I'm used to it. So if I'm doing social engineering, and I know you very well, the chances that I know those answers are relatively good, especially if we've been friends for a number of years. So your attempt to try and build security, let alone privacy online, doesn't work because the very things I just told you are things that people who know me well will know me anyway. This is the tough part of finding a balance between privacy, because some of those questions could be intrusive, versus finding a security balance. The bigger challenge comes in is that when you start talking about the algorithms that are used online to determine behavior or to interact with you, the currency in the world is eventually, in the digital world, going to become the algorithms. The single most expensive thing in the world eventually will become the power of the algorithms that are used to analyze data. Because everybody will get the data, like everybody will know what my mother's name is. What they do with my mother's name is a different story. It is the algorithm which will determine the ability to commoditize, let alone profit, from what you are delivering online. And once you're able to appreciate that, you suddenly start saying, how do you actually control these algorithms? What data do the cookies take? How is that data utilized? And then there's this famous word called free. There's nothing that's ever free. It's just that you haven't paid for it yet. Or you don't know how you're paying for it, but you will pay for it. That is the one consistent. So when you see applications which say to you, for example, this application is free, but it is ad-sponsored in an online application, which you download to your phone so that you can have directions, etc. What is it that you think you got for free versus what you didn't know you were paying for? Take a simple thing like a mapping application, ordinary application that you want to use in order to go out and buy a cell phone. How do you know that the map application, once you typed in the name of the cell phone that you were looking for, or the name of the shop, didn't route you past 10 other shops which were cheaper, in the hopes that you would stop there and actually buy, and then of course they get a commission from where you buy? Because why would those developers build an app, give it to you for free, just for a few adverts? How exactly are they going to fund their lifestyle, let alone feed their families, if all they're doing is making revenue out of adverts? And the reality becomes eventually that much of what we think are free applications actually has got a response that is often pivoted or controlled in terms of how we get the feedback from that app. Whether it's a mapping application, whether it's a search algorithm, it comes back and gives us things that are in the benefit of the developer. Because you don't know what the algorithm says. There's no such thing as free. It's just that you haven't paid for it. And in the digital economy, there's definitely no such thing as free. The biggest challenge ultimately is the issue of data transparency and how data is controlled, especially when it comes to online profiling. So if you take Facebook. Have you ever thought about all those times you press like? On LinkedIn, you press like. If I could monitor all the things you like, I can build a profile around you. If I can build a profile around you, I can work out what to sell to you. And if I can target how to sell to you and what to sell to you, I can be a better businessman. Because the whole challenge on the digital economy is not how much can I sell, it's how well can I target to the people who are coming to my website so I can convert every visit into a sale. In other words, having a counter at the bottom, many years ago, actually now I'm going to give my age away, approximately 25 years ago when I first learned how to code in HTML, right? The first thing I did is I built this little thing at the bottom of my web page called a counter. So I could see how many page visits I'd get. Of course, it didn't really work very well because the only person visiting the page was me. But it's fine, it's fine. Right? As I visited the page every day, I would click refresh, hoping that counter would show more than just me. Now, the point is, many people thought as long as you got a web counter at the bottom and you could count how many times people visit, it's going to turn into money. It's not. It's whether or not what I can sell when you visit turns into money. I need to get the right person to visit my site at the right time, and I need to give them the right offer in order for them to buy. And ultimately, that's where the online profiling comes in. Now, what becomes the challenge around trying to understand trust? Ultimately, if we don't get the trust challenge right, satisfaction levels, or what sometimes is referred to as buyer dissonance, increases. In the sense that your dissatisfaction with the product becomes the following. You literally say, should I have really bought this? Shouldn't I have maybe looked longer? Should I have maybe had another choice? Maybe I should have Googled other options. It's sometimes referred to as buyer's remorse. The problem about overcoming this whole satisfaction challenge is that if people don't trust you, the moment they've had one negative experience, you doubt everything that happens. Let me give you a perfect example in the real world. I drive a Toyota Yaris, and there was a recall of the airbags, right? They wanted to change all the airbags. Now, for all of you who know Toyota is known to be reliable. But it's not like I could test the airbag. You can only test the airbag in an accident. Now, the moment somebody takes the car and recalls it and says they want to change the airbags, what do you think I started wondering about? What else do they get wrong? What does not work? Do the brakes maybe not work next? I mean, is this going to be like a list of things that don't work? Now, that's the problem about satisfaction. Until that point, I was happy with my car. I drove it, I was happy. Then they recalled it and told me about the airbags. Now, that wasn't the first recall, by the way. The second recall was that they told me that on the driver's seat, there are bolts that hold the seat down. They wanted to call it back and change the bolts. Now, by opportunity number 2, I was beginning to think maybe I bought the wrong car. Because I was wondering how many more things could go wrong, right, before they go right. The reason I'm using this is because satisfaction is also subjective. And the moment you have one discordant experience, you start questioning every other. And the issue of loyalty becomes an interesting one. Now, how many people change their cell phones regularly to a different brand? Have you tried doing that lately? Have you tried going from Android to Apple? Forget going from Samsung to anything else. The reason why people stick to the same brand is because they feel comfortable. Even if they're unhappy, they feel comfortable because they know where to find what it is. And the worst part is you don't want to lose all your WhatsApp conversations. Because you can't figure out how to port it from one phone to another without losing it. And you know when you go and you ask for help, they'll tell you the following. We're going to try to do this, but something could go wrong. Now, if you've been having conversations for years with people on your phone, you don't want to lose it, let alone your photos. Right? Now, where does this fit into loyalty? It's simple. Those are the things that hook you into staying with the product. Because you don't want to lose the photos because you know where they are on the phone. And you know how good the photos are, so you stay loyal to a particular phone brand. It's the same thing with WhatsApp. If you could port from WhatsApp to something else and still keep the conversations, you would do it. But because you can't, you stay loyal to a product. In other words, it is the comfort zone that is there, and it's the same thing with trust. In e-commerce, the more trust people have is directly proportional to their ability to be loyal and their ability to switch without cost. And that's where this issue of transaction cost comes in. Because just like my example of the Toyota, I was happy with the car. I was still happy driving it. However, the moment I start having all these problems, what do I start doing? I start wondering, should I maybe sell the car? Should I incur the cost of buying a new car? And if the cost of buying a new car is actually going to make me feel safer at night, and I can afford the loss that it came from buying that car, I'm going to do that. There's a very large motor manufacturer who I won't mention, whose cars have been exploding. Literally, they've been exploding. And there have been stories about that throughout the world. We've had multiple incidents even in South Africa. Now, that motor manufacturer was the oldest American motor manufacturer in the world, so I've now given away the name. Right? They've been building vehicles for more than 110 years, approximately. The reality is that while people were comfortable buying their vehicles, the moment those engines started blowing up and you couldn't get a resale on that car, what do you think people did? They stopped buying them because nobody wanted to take the chance. And this is where transaction costs become a challenge. But what about the technology trust issues? Now, the best way to understand that is, does everybody remember Nokia? When Nokia was the leading phone. But before Nokia, there was Motorola. I remember when in the 90s, there was a Motorola phone. It used to look like what we used to call a brick. It was a physical brick-like thing. It was a huge device, right? You couldn't even put it in your pocket. As a matter of fact, it looked like this. It was about this long, that thick. If you dropped it, nothing would happen to it, right? It had life, not of like 1 hour. That thing could keep going and going and going. After Motorola, what did we get to? Nokia, right? And then slowly Sony Ericsson, and now we've got a whole lot of other brands. But why am I using that? Because at one stage, if you ask people, who would you buy a phone from? My first pager was a Motorola. My first phone was a Motorola. It's because people put trust in a brand, because they know that that brand supposedly represents the ability to be up to date. It won't go wrong. It won't fail on you. Let me use even a better example. When I got into IT, they told me certain things. They said, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. It didn't matter what you bought. You could buy IBM, you won't get fired, no matter how bad it was. Right? And I thought, okay, fine, fair enough. My career progressed. I eventually went to work for our central bank. They told me the same thing. It doesn't matter what you want to buy. If you buy IBM, you'll never get fired. Now, this is the thing about trust and technology. Not that you should buy IBM today, by the way. That's a different discussion and a different debate. The discussion was that people would make statements like that. They would make statements like, you won't go wrong with, because typically that's the degree of trust they had in it. And how does trust affect the entire partner ecosystem? Well, here's the tough part. If you have information that you share with your entire ecosystem, in other words, you sell these phones, but there's somebody who has to manufacture the cover, somebody has to manufacture the device, somebody has to build the applications, etc. And there's a data breach anywhere along the way. Who do you hold accountable? Let's use another example. You decide to go to the cloud. You decide you're going to host applications on the cloud. Thank you. The challenge is that when you decide, for example, to go to the cloud and there's a data breach at any point, who do you blame? Do you blame the internet service provider? Do you blame the cloud service provider? Do you blame the person who built the device through which you actually access the information? At what point does blame get allocated? Because very often, to the customer, they only see your name. They don't see all the people who supplied the products, including the person who supplied the hardware, which could have been vulnerable. Now, how do you get around this trust deficit? The best way to deal with this, and I've taken cognizance of the time from the chair, is as follows. Identify the customer journey. How do customers interact with the products, or whatever solution you offer? Try and figure out where trust enters into that relationship. Once you've done that, for each of the phases, put together a chart that identifies who is responsible, who is accountable, who should be consulted, who should be informed. For those of you who've worked with COBIT, it's the very same logic, except you're applying that logic to the trust journey. Once you're able to do that, for each of the processes within the business that you now need to go through, identify where you need to have somebody who owns the trust. The problem is that if you don't assign ownership to this problem to anyone, everybody will agree that trust is important. It's like everybody agrees that safety is important and security is important and privacy is important, but until you have somebody responsible for it, it won't get done. It's like a very good example of health and safety. If there's nobody responsible for health and safety, there'll never be an evacuation ever done. The only reason it got done is because it's in somebody's performance plan to make sure it gets done. You then need to be able to identify clear metrics for trust. Identify very clearly what it is that you are measuring and what you expect out of that. And then try to publicize that across the entire ecosystem. Because if you're able to publicize that and you make trust something that is visible, something that is monitored, something that is known, people, when they fail, will then be recognized. So even if they want to fail or they don't want to do this seriously enough, they will actually run the risk of being named and shamed. Ultimately, what you want to do is to then look at whether you can monitor this independently and whether or not you can incentivize the people in your ecosystem to respect this. Because here's the challenge about it. If you cannot deal with trust in that manner, you are going to pay for it. And how are you going to pay for it? Typically, if you look at it now, many companies who are online have to be insured. If you haven't resolved the issue of trust, you are going to be dealing with issues of high insurance ultimately. Put simply, not managing trust is going to cost you. Either it's going to cost you in terms of lost revenue, or it's going to cost you in terms of higher assurance. What are the critical challenges that we have to deal with as we go forward? Firstly, cryptocurrency. There's no single cryptocurrency in the world that everybody accepts. So as cryptocurrency becomes more and more common and more people wish to pay with cryptocurrency, you're going to have to determine how you're going to deal with that, or if you're going to deal with that. And because the banks don't necessarily accept cryptocurrency, these cryptocurrencies are caveat currencies that are run by third parties. How do you actually ensure that you get your money out of it? The power of cloud computing and the ability to basically set up a website anywhere in the world, host the data anywhere else in the world, create the shopping engine anywhere else in the world, let alone the product being delivered from some other part of the world, is going to extend the ecosystem. It's also going to make it cheaper for people to get into the market space. My last point, Chair, is the issue of blockchain technology. While blockchain has been spoken about in terms of the strength of blockchain and its ability to ensure resilience, we still have to adapt the digital storefront to accommodate blockchain. The biggest challenge, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have with trust is the following. The technology is hurtling forward with blockchain, with cryptocurrency, etc. But people don't necessarily need the fastest possible car. They need a car that they can rely on that will get them from where they are to where they need to be. So trying to build innovation is useful, but ensuring that the innovation delivers results, promotes e-commerce, promotes digital trust is vital. The last point which I'd like to conclude on, ladies and gentlemen, is this. As we get to a generation that has grown up with this, not with this, not with that, sorry, we are going to have a very interesting challenge. The youth of tomorrow are going to expect to engage with government, not just commerce, government, on this. They'll want to order services such as passports, ID documents on this. So even if we don't think that we must solve this problem for commercial reasons in terms of trust, we have to solve it because how our citizens engage with us in the future in terms of e-government is pivotally going to be on the basis of trust. And if they have a trust deficit in terms of e-commerce, they'll have a trust deficit in terms of e-government interactions. Because people will then be unlikely to do what? Want to use this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I wish you a wonderful day.